Complete silence. "You seem a little on edge," Olivia said. "Maybe you should sit down for a minute." Something about the way she spoke made my skin crawl. Her words carried a soft, rhythmic whisper, each S sliding into the next with an almost mechanical cadence. It reminded me of the loom, not obviously, not enough to explain, just enough that I couldn't ignore it. "I'm fine," I replied, studying her carefully. "Are you okay? You seem different." "It's just my hair." She smiled and tossed it over one shoulder. "What do you think?" For a split second, it didn't look like hair. It looked like yarn. I couldn't explain why. The texture seemed wrong somehow, just as her voice had sounded wrong. My mind insisted it was ordinary hair, yet something deeper refused to believe it. "It looks nice," I finally said. Her smile widened. Her teeth caught the light. For one disturbing moment, they reminded me of the dull plastic faces of the mannequins. Then they reminded me of the smooth wooden shuttle from a weaving loom. I quickly looked away. The bell above the front door rang. A customer had entered. "I'll get it," Olivia called as she headed toward the shop front. As she walked away, something caught my eye. A thick strand of crimson thread trailed behind her shoe. It dragged silently across the floor. I couldn't see where it ended. "Olivia," I called. I wanted to tell her. "1 second," she replied without turning around. "Let me help the customer first." Her voice still carried that quiet, weaving rhythm. The red thread continued sliding after her. There was no spool, no knot, no visible end. It just kept going. Curiosity got the better of me. I bent down, picked up the thread, and followed it in the opposite direction. It stretched much farther than it should have, around corners, through narrow doorways, past cramped storage rooms, down dim corridors I barely remembered existing. The journey felt impossibly long, longer than the inside of my shop should ever have allowed. And yet, everything around me looked almost familiar. Shelves overflowed with folded fabric. Tables were covered in rows of sewing needles sorted by size. Spools of thread stood stacked from floor to ceiling. Every object belonged in a tailor's shop, even if I couldn't remember seeing this particular room before. Then I found something that absolutely didn't belong. A hole had been torn through one of the walls. It was enormous, large enough for me to walk straight through without lowering my head. I had no desire to do that. The edges weren't jagged like broken plaster or splintered wood. Instead, they were frayed, soft, fuzzy, like the ripped edge of an old sweater slowly unraveling. Thousands of loose fibers hung from the opening, twitching ever so slightly. The wall itself no longer looked as though it had been built from bricks and plaster. It looked woven, every strand peeled away from the torn opening, and stretched toward the darkness beyond, toward a single object waiting in the shadows. A loom. It wasn't my loom. At first glance, it looked almost identical to the one sitting in my shop, but something about it felt cleaner, newer. It stood alone in a bright, spacious room that looked nothing like the cramped maze I'd walked through moments earlier. Sunlight poured through an excessive number of tall windows, washing over polished wooden floors and exposed brick walls, giving the place the appearance of a stylish converted loft. The walls weren't empty. Large woven tapestries hung neatly between the windows. Each one depicted scenes from my tailor shop. Some showed messy workrooms overflowing with unfinished projects and scattered fabric. Others captured Olivia and me helping customers as if someone had quietly watched our every movement. Several focused entirely on my mannequins, frozen in unnervingly lifelike poses. There was even one of Olivia, and another of me. Every tapestry had been woven with unbelievable precision. Every thread, every fold of fabric, every tiny detail had been recreated perfectly. I instinctively stepped closer, then I hesitated. The countless red threads stretching from the torn opening no longer looked like loose strands of yarn. They looked like a spider's web, dense, waiting. My stomach tightened. Without thinking, I took a step backward. Olivia was standing behind me. I hadn't heard her arrive. For the second time that day, she had appeared without making the slightest sound. "You found my thread," she whispered. Her voice carried that same rhythmic cadence. "You weren't supposed to stop." Before I could react, her hands clamped onto my shoulders. She shoved me toward the ragged opening. I fought with everything I had. I kicked, I twisted, I clawed at her arms. It didn't matter. She was impossibly strong. Slowly, relentlessly, she forced me closer and closer to the portal. The red thread was still wrapped around my hand. As I struggled, I spotted a pair of polished tailoring shears resting on a nearby work table. With one desperate lunge, I grabbed them. The moment the thread passed within reach, I slammed the blades shut with every ounce of strength I had. Snip! The crimson thread parted instantly. There was no resistance. It sliced as easily as ordinary sewing thread. Behind me, Olivia screamed. The cry lasted less than a second. Then, nothing. The crushing pressure on my shoulders disappeared. I spun around, ready to shove her aside and run, but Olivia was gone. In her place lay a heap of clothing, scraps of fabric, thread, buttons, and sewing tools piled roughly into the shape of a human body. A crumpled t-shirt formed what might have been a face. A loosely draped scarf suggested shoulders and arms. Everything was tangled together by the same thick crimson thread, yet somehow, nothing had actually been stitched. The pile was already collapsing under its own weight. The instant I touched it, the shape dissolved completely, scattering across the floor into an ordinary mess of fabric and supplies. A soft slithering sound echoed behind me. I turned just in time to see the severed end of the red thread racing back through the torn opening. I lunged for it. Too late. It slipped into the room beyond before my fingers could reach it. Almost immediately, the loom sprang back to life. Click, clack, click, clack. The shuttle shot back and forth with impossible speed. As it worked, the loom began pulling fresh strands from the frayed edges of the opening itself. I stumbled backward, terrified the hole would continue tearing wider around me, but it didn't. The opening remained the same size. Instead, the thread seemed to be coming from somewhere much deeper inside the walls. How much of my shop had already been woven into this thing? The shuttle flew faster than my eyes could follow. Someone was operating the loom, or something. The moving threads blocked almost everything from view. Only pale white hands occasionally slipped into sight before vanishing again behind the weaving. Could that be Olivia? The real Olivia? Holding my breath, I carefully edged sideways, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was sitting behind the loom. The creature behind the loom was not Olivia. It wasn't even human. It looked as though someone had ripped apart dozens of mannequins and crudely fused the pieces into a single impossible body. Arms sprouted from every direction. I counted at least 3, though there were probably more. Hands clustered together in grotesque groups. Some shared the same wrist, branching into multiple palms, while others burst directly from the creature's torso at impossible angles, twitching as though they were trying to crawl away from the body that imprisoned them. Every finger was alive with frantic motion.